Do you think that we got a podcast out of this conversation?
Welcome from Alpha to Omega.
Hello, and welcome to the 36th episode of From Alpha to Omega. Today is Sunday, the 11th of August 2013, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. This week's show has financially been kept alive in a near vegetative state by the generous donation of John L. Any donations you'd like to send my way by making a once-off donation or signing up for a monthly subscription will be very gratefully received and will be used to usher forth the revolution this week's guest Doug Lain and I are eagerly awaiting. Doug has returned to the show this week to tell us about his new novel Billy Moon that is due out from Tor Publishers on the 27th of August. Using Doug's novel for the basis of the conversation, we meander through a vast array of topics, including the May 1968 aborted revolution in France, the interaction of ideology, architecture and space, the rationality of socialism, the Situationists and the Occupy movement, how we need to both dream and escape the dream, the structure of a new revolutionary strategy, the need for bastards, and his upcoming Think the Impossible book and podcast tour to San Francisco, Chicago and New York City. Oh yes, and no conversation between myself and Doug will be complete without a rant about our dear friend Karl Marx. We join the conversation as we find ourselves musing upon the ideology of some of our centre-left economists. I think there's so much ideology, even when people try to come at these things non-ideologically.
I think there's more ideology than when people come at it full on as ideologists, because if you know what your ideology is, if you say, look, I'm coming at this from this school, here's the array of presuppositions I have, here's my perspective, then that perspective can be questioned. If you're coming at it without ideology, supposedly you're going to have a whole bunch of mishmash of ideas that you don't even know that you're holding, possibly. That's
true. Or they actually might be aware as well. Like, I think a lot of these people are aware,
of like being basically neoconservative.
I wouldn't say, it's hard to know what they are, you know what I mean? I would say liberal, I would say. Don't see any problems with capitalism if you took the growth out.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people like that.
I wouldn't have any problems with capitalism if we took the exploitation out of it.
That's it. You know what I mean? But we need to take the growth out as well, Doug.
Okay, or both. Okay, we'll take both those things out of it.
I know, it's sorted.
Yeah, there we go. One thing that I've only come to understand recently, and I don't understand it in terms of like actually having all the facts in front of me. I only just have a soundbite about it. But when Kleiman points out that there's 5 times more investment spending than there is consumption spending, it makes me wonder about how many resources are going into projects that are really circular and that don't actually ever service any human need.
I'd say huge amounts. We were trying to get our house in order before the baby arrives, and we were trying to clean up the house, and the house is just full of junk,
Right, but all that junk in your house, I mean, that's the thing about all the junk in your house, is all of that is consumption spending.
It's consumption spending, yeah. But like, if you want to look at actually the value it gives us.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. No, yeah, right.
It's nearly zero, and that's on the consumption side. So you can imagine what it's like on the other side.
Right. Well, this is what I don't quite know if I quite grasp, is that it seems to me likely that spending doesn't necessarily equate, especially in the productive process, to the production of that much physical commodity.
I think it produces loads of commodity, but I think the problem is what is the commodity used for?
Right, but I mean, it could be that there's spending going on that is not actually put into the production of physical objects that we're talking about when we're talking about investment spending.
Like what? Like a service or something?
Yeah, like service or paying for management or I don't know all. I mean, this is where my understanding breaks down. But it's not like they're spending on production of commodities alone. They're buying. I guess there is going to be a correlation physically. There's going to be like buildings and computers and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's no reason to think that in the kind of investment arena there's going to be a radically different shape to how it's managed or produced. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the thing is, I would think that the things that are produced are not produced with any real kind of rationality, if you know what I mean.
Right. Except to continue production.
Exactly. Just not even production. Production is secondary. I'd say profit. It's just purely profit.
Right. Yeah. Right. But here's the thing that I just realized is that I think my confusion was that I think of investment as sometimes what's going on in Wall Street. And I think of it in terms of financial investment instead of productive investment. And that's the thing I got to keep in mind is that 5 times more in productive investment, 5 times more in the real economy.
The way I think of it is like productive consumption, if you know what I mean.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's just like to produce, we need to consume. That's the way I kind of think of it myself.
Yeah. And he points out, like in feudal times, we didn't have any investment for, production. It was always basically aimed at use value and creating things that people are going to use. Now we have this whole arena where what we're doing is we're just servicing and maintaining the production process. Sometimes, as his little example would be mining for iron, which is then used to make steel instruments that were turned into mining equipment so we can mine for iron.
Exactly, yeah. It's just this thing whirring out of control off on its own.
So I think that part of the equation is really important to put forward, especially for people who are kind of take this Malthusian line about how we have too many people and people's lives are too soft and our houses are full of junk. And I mean, it's that last bit is absolutely true in my case. I think actually what's weird in the United States and maybe in the first world in general is if you're poor, you're more likely to have tons of crap everywhere. And if you're relatively wealthy, you'll have a
sparse 1960s James Bond villain lifestyle.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. I end up, if I want to understand things well, putting things into as the simplest terms possible so that I can actually have more complex thoughts. If I try to just go directly to the complexity, I often get lost and have to take a nap. Well, anyway, I enjoy listening to your show. I'm always, just think of me as the guy out there going, "Hey, not Marxist enough."
Billy Moon was Christopher Robin Milne, the son of A.A. Milne, the world-famous author of Winnie the Pooh and other beloved children's classics. Billy's life was no fairy tale though. Being the son of a famous author meant being ignored and even mistreated by famous parents. He had to make his own way in the world, define himself, and reconcile his self-image with the image of him known to millions of children. A veteran of World War II, a husband and father, he is jolted out of midlife ennui when a French college student revolutionary asks him to come to the chaos of Paris in revolt. Against a backdrop of the apocalyptic student protests and general strike that forced France to a standstill that spring, Milne's new French friend is a wild card, able to experience alternate realities of the past and present. Through him, Milne's life is illuminated and transformed, as are the world-altering events of that year. The book it seems to me full of symbolism, and I'm wondering what were some of the symbolic reasons you chose Christopher Milne?
Yeah, I can answer that one. Why would Christopher Robin ever go to Paris would be one way of asking the question. And why would it be interesting to a reader that if he did, why would I want him to? And the main thing is that Christopher Robin was, in real life, was a man who tried to overcome his origin story. They tried to overcome being a boy in these little Winnie the Pooh stories. He had to live down being the son of A. A. Milne, the great writer, and more than that, he had to live down being the fictional son of A. A. Milne, who had a childish and quite, wonderful relationship with a stuffed bear that everyone loved. He had to try to live his life beyond that. So he was always resisting this fictional story that he really felt, on the one hand, had been stolen from him in a way, because he did have imaginary adventures with his stuffed animals that his father purloined and used in his work. But he also thought that they had nothing to do with him anymore either, that it was really the Christopher Robin in these stories was really A. A. Milne's vision of his own childhood and had nothing really to do with Christopher's childhood. So for Christopher Milne, the man, there was a desire to be seen as a serious person, as an adult man. Not that was so hard for him. He did a lot of things, as everybody does, to grow up and have a life of his own. He was a vet in World War II. He ran a bookstore in Devon. He had a wife and child. He was a naturalist and involved in protecting Ashton forests and in protecting the environment. All in all, in real life, he was quite able to get beyond his fictional origin story and live his life in a meaningful way for himself. But I thought that struggle was really interesting in terms of what happened in May '68, in this attempt to try to create a new kind of society that might be more mature and more self-aware than the society we're in now. So I wanted Christopher Robin Milne to be involved in that struggle. Also, I wanted him to be involved in the struggle because he represented youth in a certain way. Nobility of youth and the imagination that comes with being young. So he embodied all of that, and the student and worker strikes in May 1968 were youthful rebellion. They came out of the sense of freedom that maybe only the young could have, but there was an immaturity to it as well. And I thought if this guy who was so concerned about being mature would find something of value in this youthful rebellion, but at the same time give something to it in this story, that some new kind of understanding of what happened in May '68 might be the result.
There was something about, you mentioned in the novel, about the dream and the importance of the dream. By this, are you talking of, say, the ability for us as a society to dream what could be and how we can go about achieving this, and how we can get away, like Christopher Robin wanted to get away from his origin, how we can break with our origin?
I meant that, but I also meant the dream that we actually live in now was important. It's like for me, one of the things I'm playing with in this book is the fictional nature of reality, this ideological nature of reality, the fact that we are living in a space that can never return to being directly real, but is always going to be, any space we create or alter will be in the service of ideology. The dream parts of this book are about, one, recognizing that you're already in a dream, and then two, using what you know of the dream you're experiencing to change the dream.
When you say we're already in the dream, what dream do you mean?
Well, I mean, in the book, the dream was actually the novel, right? So the story that was being told was the dream on one level. The other thing is the dream might be the kind of social relations that we have now, a kind of capitalist society we have now is a kind of dream too, because it doesn't have a foundation in the properly real. Its construction is something that is made by human minds. It's an activity that we're doing rather than something we're discovering outside of ourselves. So that makes it a kind of dream. Dream is, in a way, in this book, is synonymous with ideology. The people who were kind of the ideological or intellectual leaders of certain segments of the student strikers in May 1968 were called the Situationists, and Henri Lefebvre was an influence on the Situationists, and their whole critique, it was about this spectacle or this dream that is giving people a sense of who they are and what their life is about, without giving them the power to actually shape it. So the spectacle of reality television, or the daytime soap opera, or the great pop tune, or the billboards that you see as you ride the bus or take the subway to work, or what have you, the message that you get through the media and the imagery that you get through films, all of that is a way of giving you the sense of a lived experience, which is actually not your own, which you're actually alienated from. That realization of that dream, understanding the nature of that dream, was another part of my book, and something that the Situationists were after.
When I listen to the talk of the Situationists and their idea of the spectacle as opposed to, say, the organization, it strikes me as very much of its time a kind of rebellion against any type of a Leninist or Stalinist organizational form.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that I don't know if their critique of the spectacle could be limited to that critique of the vanguard party, but
maybe not limited, but I see that influenced.
Yeah, it fits. Those two things fit together, because it was for, if you want to get deep into or not too deep, but get into the thicket a little bit on Guy Debord and his theories. For Debord, there was the concentrated spectacle and the diffuse spectacle, and in the concentrated spectacle, like the time of the Soviet Union, you had images of charismatic leaders who would live out history for you. And in the diffuse spectacle, you had a multiplicity, a pluralist kind of cavalcade of images of people that were representing you and depicting history's unfoldment as something happening outside of your control. But the main thing about the spectacle is that it is talking about the way, the kind of stories or dreams that we might have that give our life a sense of meaning, but a sense of meaning that's always outside of our control. So in a way, it's talking about the religious character of lived experience in a capitalist society or in a really existing socialist society. But what I wanted to say about that was the spectacle is not merely this inert position that we're in, where we are watching instead of acting, but it's also this conviction that we have that we're watching and not acting. It's the misrecognition of our own lives. It's the way we avoid understanding that we're actually recreating and reproducing the terms of our life every day. So it's a story that is always beyond us about what life means and what is desirable and who we are, and our acceptance of that story in a way, or our dependence upon that story being outside of us. So the desire is to act, and then through your action, grab hold of the world and know what to do next, right? And just kind of spontaneously to take hold of the reins and shift the society to understand the totality in that moment of action. But the critique is that it's an intuitive understanding. And what intuition means is that it's still kind of religious. What is not understood is how really what seems to be obvious and just something you can intuit and know somewhat directly is actually always, kind of constructed on a whole bunch of arguments and things that are in the background of that you've learned already. That intuitive understanding of the situation has always got to be broken apart. And so that spontaneous action is going to have to be followed up by planned action, by thoughtful action.
When we think of, say, the whole 1968 episode, and say something that certainly probably inspired by it would be the Occupy movement. They had the action, the spontaneous act, but they didn't have that follow-on that you talk about.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair to say. The comparison between Occupy Wall Street and May 1968, I think, is an obvious one, and it's one which I think the Occupy Wall Street people themselves kind of welcomed and thought of at the very outset of what they were doing.
It's kind of weird that they should, on a certain sense, that they should be glad to have that relation, because one would probably, on the whole, think of 68 as kind of a glorious failure.
Yes, but a glorious failure. I mean, you know, for me in my 20s, May 1968 was the most hopeful thing I'd ever heard about, because the whole country was on strike, and everyone thought they really could create a new society, or many people thought this. At the very least, everyone thought they could make their lives a whole lot better, and many people thought they could create a new kind of world. And it gripped a whole country for a month. It was, the de Gaulle had to go, and he was going to get help from the Germans, I think, to send in armies to take care of this problem. And he didn't actually have to do that. And yeah, it did fail on its own. If you grew up in the 80s, like I did, under Reagan and Bush, there was a sense that, no, there's never going to be any kind of real serious movement to create a new society. This is it. And to find out about that just a couple of years before I was born, the whole country of France seemed like up in the air, up for grabs. That was exciting. And so to try to recreate that today is the kind of thing that I think that certain kind of radicals would want to do. But the problem is, without thinking it through, like remember the ending, and not realizing, I think that a lot of times what people will do when they look at 68 will say, the problem was they just didn't do it enough. What they did, they just didn't, somehow they didn't have the conviction to go all the way with it. If they'd just been a little bit more pure and good-hearted and committed, then this would have, they were so close. All they had to do was just a little bit more, and this would have worked. So you try to do it again. But what you're missing is maybe there were some problems in the ideas, some problems in how they were going about it right from the start.
One thing, when I look at, say, all the different revolutions that happened across the world, communist-inspired or socialist-inspired, the ones that actually in some way completed themselves usually had a vanguard party, some kind of revolutionaries who were basically tough bastards who would have any problem with killing a lot of people to get their hands on the power to recreate the society. They were successful in that they got their hands on power, but that was the contradiction, that once they got their hands in power, they weren't a success, because they're not the type of people you want to get your hands on power.
Right.
But then you have, say, something like 68, where you have people organizing that really don't want to have that other outcome. But unfortunately, their tactics are insufficient to get to the place where they want to get. It's like in a time of war, they give make Churchill Prime Minister, not because he was popular or anything, but because he was a really tough bastard. And that there seems to be some kind of to me, when I think about all this, I always think that surely there should be a strategy such that you can combine the good and the bad.
Yeah, let's be clear here about what happened in May 68. It was not as though you had a bunch of Gandhi clones take the street. There was a willingness to be, on the part of the students and the workers, to be really tough and violent. They threw paving stones at the cops. They burnt down the stock exchange. These were street fighters.
Yes, but not largely coordinated.
They held the cops at bay for a month. They were not just wiped out. I think they could have been if the state had been willing to kill them. Fighting was not on the level of that kind of battle. But they were not by any means soft. Here's my thought that's kind of in this book, which is that the trouble was not that they didn't have, if they had turned to a strong leader and had won, I don't know what the situation was like in France, but it seems to me that they would have probably ended up in some situation similar to either what happened in China or Russia, or some sort of more likely social democratic reformer taking power in France. Okay, if they'd had a real political agenda to take power in the state, I think that's probably what might have been possible. But what they were aiming at, and what the reason it's a beautiful failure, not just a failure, was not only to take power, but to change power. And they thought they could do it spontaneously. They thought they already had the change, that they already embodied the change that they wanted to put into the world. And what I'm saying in this more and more, and what I try to say in some ways in this book, is that the one thing that would be necessary for that kind of change is to accept the fictional quality of who you are now. You're reaching out to some sort of new dream rather than reaching out to the firm earth to walk on. So you're going to have to risk yourself. And the thing is, whether you have a strong leader in charge or you've got some sort of workers' council, if you're not making that change to the base, to the space, then you're not going to end up in a new position. You're going to end up in some version of the Soviet Union or some version of Sweden at best or something like that.
When we look towards, say, the Occupy or 68 and trying to get learnings from these things, it seems to me that there is a lot of space for kind of strategic thought about organizational structure, both, say, pre-revolutionary, during the revolution, and post-revolution, and that these three organizational forms may be entirely different at those different phases, and that there seems to be a reliance on one organizational form for, say, the three kind of periods that are involved in such a project. Yeah.
Well, this is the kind of question about, like, the question of organization that my book doesn't really approach. And I think it's the kind of question that you would hear a lot of people talk about when they want to look back on May 68 and recreate it. It's like, well, did they have the right kind of organizational form? Should they have had more workers' counselors, or should it have changed at this point, or that kind of thing? And I don't feel equipped to deal with that question. And also, it's not the kind of question I can really think of a way to write about interestingly in a novel.
When I was reading the book, I was thinking about the parts where you talk about, people having to dream. And I was thinking, that, this is the creative act or the dream act, say like Marx's Capital was a creative act, and that we can interpret the dream, as a creative act as well.
Well, there's a point in the book where I get really metafictional and one of the characters digs a hole in the novel and falls out of the book. And then that character doesn't end up surviving to the end of the story. And I think that's the thing about what we have to accept about dreaming or coming up with a new society, is that we're not going to get to a rock solid foundation. He digs a hole looking for the end of the dream and the beginning of reality. And he doesn't find it. He just disappears instead. And maybe that's the kind of solution. But to be really honest, I don't quite know what the hell I'm talking about with this book. Because I don't quite understand what it would take to create something that could last, that's new, without feeling as though you're standing on solid ground when you do it. Except maybe that what you would create that's new is this sense of not being on solid ground. And that would be a good first step towards creating a better society, because we wouldn't have these religious convictions about the way the world was structured. That we would have a feeling that things could be changed, that we could live in a more experimental kind of society. But, I think that feels kind of woo-woo to say it out loud. So I write a really woo-woo book.
Well, I suppose the thing is about perhaps what are the structures that we could socially put in place such that that becomes a reality.
Yeah.
That the structures are dynamic and not congealed, and that they can live and augment and change in their own way, perhaps.
Protest now begins to orchestrate its acts with symbols and tactics distilled from French revolutionary tradition. On May 9th, the militant left rallies in its traditional meeting hall, La Mutualité. Its keynote speaker is Alain Crevin, who will become an official presidential candidate in 1969 to gain free exposure for revolutionary propaganda on national television. Paris has again become the center for European revolt. Radical students from France are joined by representatives of Italy, Germany, Belgium, and Spain to solidify the movement and sustain its momentum. Speaker follows speaker denouncing capitalism, imperialism, bourgeois nationalism, and bourgeois culture.
Dieses freien Landes nur betreten, von der Sicherheitspolizei ins nächste ausfliegende.
Anti-fascist slogans burst enthusiastically from those for whom even the Algerian nightmare is a faded childhood memory.
La violence est nullement un privilège de celle-ci. Elle n'est en fait que la forme courante qu'adopte la dictature des classes bourgeoises, et plus précisément celle de l'oligarchie monopoliste, lorsqu'un mouvement populaire vient remettre en cause son pouvoir.
La structure autoritaire de l'université est contre la bourgeoisie. Vive le socialisme! 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 Vive le socialisme!
So, Doug, I listened to your latest show there with the feminist blogger Shattersnipe.
You know, let me tell you what she does. What she does on her blog is she'll watch a television program or read a novel, and then she'll kind of evaluate: are the women characters and the people of color, are they being represented well enough? And is this a strong woman character or not? And is this a sexist depiction of a woman? So now my problem with that is it's like so fragmented. That approach is like you're looking at one character with maybe a checklist of what you want to see. You know, you want them to be strong. You want them not to fall into a stereotype. You don't want them to be just a sex object for a man in the story or an assistant, or whatever, helper. But the weird thing is, it's actually no character could actually get through the checklist without making a mistake. And one example was like a black warrior character on the television show Firefly. You know, if she's depicted as being too strong, then that's that's racist actually in this case. And if she's weak, then that's racist too. And what I want to see is like a critique where you go, okay, what's going on in the genre? This more total critique. I mean, this is the Marxist side of me. It's like, what's going on in the whole story?
Like a systemic view.
Yeah. That's putting this character in this position. What assumptions are in these kinds of stories that generate these kinds of characters? Because I think the genre needs to change. Our fantasies need to change if we're going to really not have these kinds of problems. And I think that this feminist critic is right to be concerned about these kinds of problems, but our solution, I think, is wrong-headed. This idea that you can just subject each experience of reading or watching to a litmus test, and and if they come up wanting, launch a Twitter campaign or something, it just seems,
Well, I have a question for you then. In your novel, your character Michelle, the girl in it who's trying to liberate herself.
Oh yeah, and by the way, her name is no longer Michelle. It's Natalie. It's been changed, but yes.
So Natalie, I don't think she would fit very well into Shattersnipe's view of the woman. She's good looking, gets dressed up in nice clothes to go off with a strange artist and mess around.
Yeah.
What do you think about what she says when you look at your novel?
Well, I think I walk a fine line with Natalie. I mean, one of the things about it is that Natalie is a character who's been given the task to live out the 60s image of a liberated young woman as created by Francois Sagan for her book Hello Sadness or Bonjour Triste. And so she is intentionally, as a person and as a character in the story, working to embody an image of female sexual liberation and finding it wanting, as she goes along. But the whole purpose behind trying to live that out is to find the contradictions in it and to transcend them.
But you didn't make her an ugly woman, for example.
Well, no. No, I didn't make an ugly woman. And I don't think a so-called ugly woman would have been given that task. Maybe she would have. Maybe it would have been more interesting. But yeah, okay, you got me there. I mean, but yeah. On the one hand, I wanted the character to be self-aware because she was trying to live through that kind of stereotype about what a sexually liberated woman would be like. I wanted her to transcend that.
So she had a level of self-awareness about what her role was.
She would be self-aware and active as a character in the story.
Not passive.
Right. But on the other hand, as much as she was playing with that, my own, proclivities and the desires of maybe my doppelgangers in the story were at play too. I would rather write about an attractive woman's sexuality than one that I define, in words as unattractive. I mean, not that I have a very narrow definition of what's attractive either, but just that ugly has a meaning when you put it on the page. And also, if I had written about a woman who was ugly, any way I tried to describe that woman would offend somebody, right? If she's fat, well, that's not always ugly. Big nose, that's not always ugly.
Well, it's weird. Like, if you ever see like a supermodel sometimes, and they're quite extreme, their features, they're kind of perfect looking. Yeah. And then sometimes you might see some paparazzi photo of them with their sister. And their sister is just slightly different, but she's kind of really ugly looking. Like, if you were to describe the two of them, you describe them both exactly the same way, but you wouldn't be able to catch what it is that makes them good look.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. But you could put it down on a page and just say ugly, and then And all you have to do is say ugly at the top and then list the description, and it could be the same description.
You say ugly first, and then you list.
Yeah. Yeah. And whatever it is, it's like, bulbous breast, but ugly. It's like, okay.
An ordinary dinner party, the sort of occasion we all enjoy. The men are exchanging witty stories. And look at the women, aren't they pretty? Look at the way they laugh. They're delightful. But now the conversation turns to more serious matters.
I wonder if the government should return to the gold standard.
I think it should.
Good. Then we're all agreed.
But oh dear, what's this? One of the women is about to embarrass us all.
I think the government should stay off the gold standard so that the pound can reach a level that will keep our exports competitive.
The lady has foolishly attempted to join the conversation with a wild and dangerous opinion of her own. What half-baked drivel! See how the men look at her with utter contempt.
Daphne, we're going home.
Women, know your limits. Now let's see the proper way.
Good. So we're all agreed. We should return to the gold standard.
Oh, I don't know anything about the gold standard, I'm afraid, but I do love little kittens. They're so soft and furry.
What a delightful thought, you dear, sweet, fragile little thing.
Women, know your limits. In thought, be plain and simple, and let your natural sweetness shine through.
Here's a quote of Lefebvre that's in the book. Once physical space is altered, once the real world is occupied by representational space, reclamation of any space for other than ideological use is constrained. Can you parse that?
Well, in a way, that's almost a tautology. And it really, I think, comes close to one of the major concerns of my novel, too. One way to think about taking real physical space and altering it so that it becomes representational space.
What does representational space mean?
Well, there's the way that Lefebvre thinks about it, and there's a way we could think about it in really simple terms. Representational space actually, I think, in Lefebvre's way of thinking would be, here's what I'm going to say, and this may not be right, but representational space might be an actual space in which you live in, but which is designed, which is it's not a neutral space. It's a space that exists because of of all the other kinds of spaces that are going on. I mean, the easiest way to think about this is when you walk into, let's say, a church. The church has a structure to it that breaks up the space so that it creates a certain kind of idea. So you're in the church, you've got the crucifix on the wall, you've got the separation between the priests and the congregation, you've got the pews and the fold-out kneelers where you can kneel to pray, you've got the communion wafers, you've got the holy water. It's all going on, and this is defining the space that you're in. You're now in a representational space.
So the structure of our reality is the physical structure of the buildings or whatever somewhat restrict or influence thought in certain ideological ways.
Right.
Like you go into a cathedral and they've got very, very high ceilings, and you go in and you go, wow, I'm filled with awe.
Right.
This place must have the Holy Ghost in it.
Exactly. Right. So you've got these ideas that are informing how the space is shaped, and which are also informing your relationship to it. So what he's saying is, once you live in a world where real space has been altered by ideas, it is impossible to kind of get back to real space except through more ideas. You know, you can't get at space except in the service of one ideology or another.
So in the case, say, of like Speer's fascist architecture, you know, it was designed to represent Hitler and fascism in a certain way, but that also then influenced the way people acted with respect to Hitler and fascism. And the only way you can get away from this is for new ideas to come in and replace the original idea, and then make them real in the world.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly how I interpret that. I think there's an alternate interpretation, which is kind of melancholic, where you say the exact same words that Henri Lefebvre says, but you mean that it's that you are sad about having to live with ideology, and you're holding out hope for a return to real, direct, lived experience in a space that's unpolluted by these ideologies and these represented spaces.
This would be a kind of a primitivist.
Yeah, not necessarily, fully worked out the way a primitivist would, but I think that the reason why Henri Lefebvre and the Situationists who were influenced by him and influenced him are attractive to American primitivist anarchists is because they have precisely that kind of melancholic reading of Lefebvre. I think it's a misreading. I don't know if it's a misreading that started with Lefebvre or not, but I would say it's a misreading.
What do you mean by socialist space being rational?
These are all quotes from a section in my novel where the protagonist is attending a lecture by a character who is based on Henri Lefebvre. The question about rational space is key because in one way of approaching reason and rationality would be that reason gives you actually that access to the real in a direct way without any irrationality in it, without any ideas in it that don't belong there. So you could have a rational space where all that was happening is that the real biological needs of the people were being met and their real selves were being expressed at the same time in a rational, reasonable way without any religious or superstitious nonsense to muddy it up or any ideologies to muddy it up.
Only the socialist ideology.
Only the socialist ideology is the right one, right? That can do all this.
Yeah.
That's one way approach to it, to reason. The other approach to it would be, and I think this is what the protagonist is pushing Henri Lefebvre's doppelganger there in that scene to admit, is that there is always going to be kind of an unreason, an irrationality in any ideology and any space that's already been altered. So the notion of a truly rational space is itself kind of irrational and maybe the most ideological thing you can posit. There's that debate going on in that scene. But the debate is complicated by the fact that the main character might be said to be a schizotype. He certainly is not always clear about what's really happening and what's a dream for himself.
You speak of Bergson in the book as well as claiming that you had to go beyond rational thought in order to know anything. What does he mean by this?
I think this is the flip side of this notion of pure reason that can directly access the world. It's just saying you have to find what you can know intuitively, without having to think about it, without having to implement these ideas that, and these logics which are always polluted. I don't think that it's actually the opposite, really, of this pure rational space. It's this notion that we can just go back to a point when our reality was not polluted by all these highfalutin ideas that humans have or that thinking beings have, and we can have this direct experience. At least that's how I read Bergson. And that's how my characters read him. But I think the first step to creating those kinds of structures is to accept this notion that we're not going to be founding these structures on some sort of eternal principles or some sort of direct communication with the way the world ought to be. That, we don't have the luxury of knowing that.
Well, I suppose reality is messy. Certainly my house is.
Yeah, and that's why everything, people start to realize they're in a dream, everything becomes mud in my novel. Which is a connection. Also, I tried to put this little bit of the Aboriginal notion of dream time into the book, but it's very filtered and veiled. Well, maybe I should talk a little bit about the tour. I'm going to be going on tour. I'm going to go to San Francisco, Chicago, New York to do readings from the book. But at the same time that I do these readings, I'm going to try to put together little interviews with people who I think are interesting around the subjects that are in the book. So in New York, I'm going to be talking to Mackenzie Wark, who wrote a book he's written a couple books about the Situationists. The most recent one being The Spectacle of Disintegration. I'm going to be talking to Margaret Kimberly from the Black Agenda Report about Edward Snowden and the control society that we're in now. And I'm going to be talking to Andrew Kleiman about his ideas of Marxist humanism. I hope that my book will be a way, at least when I'm on tour and maybe beyond that, for people to start asking questions about what happened at Occupy and what it would take to think of themselves in a new kind of society.
So your Kickstarter campaign has been fully funded?
Yeah, it has been fully funded.
How much did you get? $2,000?
No, it was a little over $4 million, which means I'll be able to do some cocaine while I'm in New York.
Oh, brilliant.
No. Edit that out.
Well, thanks very much, Doug, for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks very much, Doug, for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks very much, Doug, for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks very much, Doug, for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
You say you don't want me coming around anymore. You sit in the window, but you won't answer the door.
On this episode, you heard the theme tune, The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters, by Sun Ra and his orchestra, Claude Debussy's Arabesque No. 1, and a clip from the documentary Confrontation Paris 1968, accompanied by Franz Liszt's Liebestraum. You also heard the Women Know Your Limits sketch by Harry Enfield, some Aborigine Dreamtime, and you are now listening to the Casio tone for the Painfully Alone, Destroying the Evidence. Thanks for listening, and I hope you join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega.
Got faith, so alright. I burned all the pictures, I let the letters loose, taped over the mixes, cut the noose. There are 26 steps to your door.